Hello, it's Amanda from Suddenly Autistic, and in this video I want to explain and walk you through a scenario that happened in real life. It happened in my life a couple of weeks ago. I went to visit my psychiatrist and a routine check and came out of that meeting feeling quite misunderstood and potentially a little bit invalidated, and definitely no further forward at that point in my understanding of myself and my ability to manage my own anxiety, which is a topic I brought up. I discovered that I was autistic at the age of 46, which was a couple of years ago now, and have spent the last 2 years or so since that diagnosis unpicking and unpacking the diagnosis, which also the autism came on top of me already, knowing I had ADHD and was medicated for that, hence the psychiatrist here in Australia. They're the only ones who can prescribe the medicine. So already knew I had ADHD, then got diagnosed with autism, and alongside that generalised anxiety disorder and complex PTSD. The complex PTSD and the anxiety disorder are mental illnesses, so understanding that I'm mentally ill and that I was at that point and probably have been for quite a period of time, which comes and goes in troughs, peaks and troughs, was quite confronting. So there's all sorts of things. There's been all sorts of things to unpick, especially finding out something as fundamental as that you're autistic at the age that I was and the life stage that I was, having brought up my children to early adulthood and being in business, marriage, house, mortgage, you name it. So it wasn't like it was something that could inform my life choices. It was something that was going to be understood retrospectively. So control, that's what I want to talk about. If that sounds like something you would get some value out of, please continue watching. That would be very much appreciated. If you like this kind of thing, you can always subscribe. It's difficult for me to push that message. I know that there's a thing you have to do on YouTube, but it is what it is. I make these videos to help me gather my thoughts and organise my thoughts so that I don't fall down rabbit holes and then just clog my brain up. If they help one other person, that's fantastic. If they help more than that, wow, I will be absolutely overwhelmed. Thank you for listening and watching so far. At the moment in my life, there are some complicated scenarios that I'm having to deal with, and the situation I find myself in isn't something that began a little while ago and is likely to end very soon. These are quite pervasive, long-lasting struggles that I'm having. I'll give you a little bit of insight, but I don't want to share too much because when it involves other people, it's their privacy. But we do live with, we have my husband's dad living with us. My husband's an only child, and his parent, he's only got the one parent alive now. He lives with us and has lived with us since moving to Australia, pretty much at the beginning of our journey here. He followed straight after. These days he is rather elderly and has some complicated health situations that I wouldn't say are life-limiting because he's already exceeded a reasonable sort of length of life, but suffice to say that he's in a position now where some days he is extremely ill and other days he is capable of fulfilling the goals that he sets for himself. My husband and I are not officially carers for my father-in-law, but unofficially, of course, we are, with my husband taking up the main role in that. I was going to say the slack, but it's not the slack. He is taking up the main role. It's his dad. He has the closest relationship. When we took on this living arrangement, I was very explicit with my father-in-law around my capacity. I didn't know I was autistic at the time we made the arrangement, but it was really important for me that he understood that should he live into a ripe old age and then become quite needy, that I was definitely not capable of caring for him in a nursing sort of way. I explained what I can and can't do, and he has been and remains absolutely fine with that, absolutely fine. He's very independent and doesn't, if anything, ask for less help than he actually needs. However, I have only realised since being in a position where there is somebody clearly quite needy around, and that is upsetting for me to see sometimes, and that is making me wonder what to do. I've only realised that while I can set that intellectual boundary, having that feel right in my body is a completely other thing. And what I'm finding in myself is that I am finding it really difficult on a day-to-day basis to get past the situation of his life. So he's not asking anything of me, but when I see my father-in-law sitting outside and looking frail, or maybe struggling to get backwards and forwards in the garden or something like that, I have an instinct to reach out to that. I also have the understanding that I have a very limited social battery, that my home is now feeling like a hospital, and that's a trigger for myself. That's sensorily overwhelming for me, that my father-in-law, while he's very independent, is likely to be the person who enjoys. He's very sociable, so the more social engagement I can give him, the better from his perspective, which is obviously the opposite for me. So that's the situation I find myself in. It's mental for me. This is, when I say mental, I don't mean it's mental as in a derogatory term. I mean it's a mental process. I am going through a lot of mental processing, and trying to find a comfortable place to be in this ever-changing environment, which is changing towards the way that people don't want things to change, which is getting more demanding and more difficult and more emotionally complex. So that's the scenario I find myself in. My husband and I also still have children, even though they're older and don't live with us, and they have their own moments and needs, and sometimes more complex and difficult than others. So there's that. There's also myself, and there's also my husband's mental health. So it's definitely quite a complex day-to-day life that I'm living, even without the autism, the ADHD, the complex PTSD, and the generalised anxiety. So it would suffice to say I do the best I can, and often it feels like it's not enough, nowhere near enough, not even enough to keep me safe. And that's really where this video is going to focus on, because that is where we get to with the psychiatrist. So I saw my psychiatrist the other day, and like psychiatrists do, because they're mental health people, they ask you how you are, and I took that as a note to talk about my mental health. So I started explaining how I was feeling incredibly anxious, really, really difficult for me to get through my day. I make plans and then I really just can't do anything. I feel like I'm losing myself. My heart is racing. I'm not sleeping well. It's difficult for me to regulate things like my normal body functions, going to the bathroom, eating, etc. I'm one of those people who tends towards not feeling their hunger, so I can go quite a long way through the day without eating, and then when I do actually notice that I'm hungry, I'm more likely to just grab something that's there, and it might not be the best choice for me. I have quite a sweet tooth. I find my brain runs out of juice quite quickly, so I could just as easily eat a whole bag of lollies than make myself a sandwich, for example. So it doesn't take much, and I understand in sharing this with you that there's some pretty big life-changing things going on, so it's understandable that would cause a little bit of distress for anyone, let alone myself. But for me, talking about me and my situation, I find it really, really difficult in a sort of average life situation to maintain my body functions in a way that keeps me safe and functional, to keep my function and my attention, my body, etc. So when there's extra stress, I actually can sometimes deal with it quite well because it changes the focus. But when the stress is lasting for a long time and is quite complex and changeable, then it makes it really hard, because I do have, as a lot of people with autism would probably recognise, I have rigid thinking. So my rigid thought process is not so much around I can't think expansively, creatively and have new ideas. It's that when I wake up in the morning or before I go to bed and set a sort of picture of what the next day is going to be, I set my sort of to-do list, if you like, or even don't, whatever, but I have some idea of what I should or want to or will or would like to achieve in that day. It might be as simple as do some art and self-care. It might be a little bit more taxing, like get into my bank and pay my bills or do some work. But that is the stuff that is difficult for me anyway, and at the moment that's becoming impossible. And what is also happening to me is I'm going into, or I am, burnt out. Hence why I thought I'd film this in my bedroom, mainly because it reminds me that, yeah, I am burnt out. This is me in a burnt out space. It's really, really difficult to live with all these layers of complexity, and I wanted to acknowledge that for myself and for anyone watching that it's a good visual reminder. It's an immersive experience of burnout, not being able to get out of your bed, doing the best you can from your bedroom. Although having said that, I do go out and walk. I'm not stuck in here all day. It's not that. So I unloaded to my psychiatrist and I started to go into my autistic way of thinking, which is and communicating, which is to say, again, more rigid, more fact-based, more information dumping. That's it. So I realise in retrospect that what I didn't give my psychiatrist, is that many clues about how I was feeling other than the physical symptoms. I was very much symptoms and this is the reason. Like, I have these symptoms and it's because of this and that and the other and blah. Not about how it made me feel. The psychiatrist listened really nicely. He's a lovely person. I have nothing bad to say about him or the facility that he works at. But after listening to that, he turned to me and said, well, Amanda, the only thing we can control is ourself. And that literally got me in the guts. It really did. That got me in the guts. I sat there listening to him then explaining about control, this concept of control, and I was wrestling with this idea in my head, listening to him, trying to be generous and think, well, where's he coming from? And it didn't resonate. It didn't feel right. I didn't feel like I was seeking more control in this environment based on my concept of control in that moment. I mentioned that to the psychiatrist. I have no problem with challenging professionals like that. I feel quite capable and quite insightful in my own way. So I said, look, it doesn't feel like that to me. I think it's something else. There's something else going on. It doesn't feel like I'm seeking more control. I'm actually fine without control. But we didn't get any further. The meeting ended, or the session ended, the consult, whatever you call it. I paid the money and went home. After that point, I have taken a lot of time deconstructing what happened, my role in that miscommunication, how I felt about it, and what are the teachable or learnable moments. What can I change? What is within my power or my control? And that's what we're going to come to next. The first thing that I did when I recovered a bit of, I suppose, momentum to start thinking again was to put down my feelings, to write down my feelings. And I turned them into a kind of rappy poem rant, I guess you'd call it. And I recorded it and I'm going to share that with you now. Too much, too fast, too little for too long. I can't do it anymore. I can't do it. I'm done. My trauma is trapped inside muscle and bone. I keep asking for help. You keep sending me home. But my home is a body I can't quite understand. Your note said learnt helplessness. What? Shifting sand. You talk of control, telling me to let go of delusions I don't have and a truth I don't own. Truth is, if you're listening, chaos is my norm. I lean into what will be. I work hard. I conform. I'm disabled. That's truth. Can't control my own self. Sure, I'll try my best. I'll get up off that shelf. I accept that some days I'm on point, I breeze through. I accept that on others I can barely make do. So this help that I've asked for, this input I seek, comes from optimism. I am strong. I'll compete. Drag my brain and my body over mountains through fire. Come rain, hail or thunder, I'll persist, I won't tire. I will seek resolutions, I will turn to the light. Transform my frustrations into a torch bright. And I'll seek my own truth and I'll find it, be free. And then when I do, I'll share generously. Because I was born curious and I was born brave. I was born to ask why. I was born to behave in a way that aligns with my heart, head and soul. Not to gaslight my closet, not to hide, not to fold, or to take easy options. My brain guarantees that. Or invent my own world to avoid the combat, or to drown in my sorrows or sink under waves of anxiety's tides and frustration's cascades. So stop trying to paint me. That's your corner, not mine. I was asking a question, so could you listen next time? In my poem, rap thing, whatever that was, I mention a thing called learned helplessness and talk about control and explain how it felt to be feeling so misunderstood and sent down the wrong path, basically. And that is completely valid. That was absolutely how I felt, and I felt like I was articulating that inner world from being triggered, essentially. I was triggered by the word control. Little did I know that give that a couple of days or so to simmer, well, not really simmer, but to sink in, that I would get some more insights that actually proved to be quite useful and that would almost take me back to agreeing with the psychiatrist that initially I was really mad with. So how on earth can that happen? Well, this is how it happened, I guess. The repulsion I felt about being pitched, to my mind at least, as having this thing called learned helplessness was a trigger. It triggered me in the way of, it felt like a shot to the heart, it felt like a big misunderstanding. And that's where there's often some learning to be had, because the things that really get to us, that really get your feelings going and make you end up almost in a dark place, can usually send you to the light. So learned helplessness is a psychological condition with an origin around having no control. It's about being stuck in a situation, or feeling stuck. You might actually be, you might not be, where you actually have no power, or you feel like you have no power and no choice. So it's a kind of resignation. It's a passivity. It's passive. There's not an action in it. So you have learned to become that helpless because you have either had no power in the past, or you have been constantly finding yourself in positions where nothing you do works. So it's like, well, what do I do now? I'm just going to resign to it, just going to let it wash over me, or whatever. The fact that I kind of spun it that way in my head was extremely telling, because that is how I feel often as somebody who's autistic. It's quite often the case that I go into a situation and give it my best shot and remain as open as I can and listen and watch and respond, and still come away feeling like, well, nobody understood me. In the early days of going to seek help for that kind of thing that would then make me feel quite sad and disconnected, it was quite common for counsellors, mental health professionals to almost treat that, the fact that, I'm never understood, people always misunderstand me, the always and never type of thing, that treat that as a mental illness and a distortion of reality, when actually the good thing about knowing I'm autistic is, well, statistically speaking, if you go on the data, it's quite likely that the majority of people, at least in the short term, won't understand me, because on no level am I actually showing up as somebody with their shared reality. You know, I'm in an autistic body, I have autistic sensory thing, I have a different way of taking in and spitting out information. Everything's on a different time zone for me, so the time it takes me to process something, everyone else has gone on to something else. So I was initially, when I used to look into this, feeling invalidated, because it was like, oh, I'm imagining this and actually it's just all in my head. No, I now know that I'm in reality of having this feeling of helplessness in situations, because it's real. People don't understand me, and there is a level of that. That doesn't mean I have to then continue on with that and just go, well, woe is me, mea culpa, what can I do? One of the reasons I'm making these videos is to empower myself to correct the record and to have insight in the moment, because I'm doing these retrospectively always, so something's happened and then I get triggered and then I process and make a video. And also to be there for other people who maybe haven't got the answers yet, but they certainly have the questions, or they've had the experience of feeling this level of, are you lying, are you making it up, when you go to a therapist. So learned helplessness was one of my clues, and it wasn't for until a bit longer that I actually looked at control, looked at the whole meaning behind control, and started to deconstruct that and find out where learned helplessness fits in that pie. After thinking about it, I realised that control, in my mind, had gone straight to domination and control, because that, sadly, is the way that control has manifested in my relationship life quite often. Not in my marriage. We have a very beautiful, even lovely marriage, which is why it's lasted so long. But in other significant relationships I've had in my life, both professional and personal, the way control has been dominating my landscape in terms of personal relationships is around domination and abuse, I guess. So that's a good clue as to why I found the whole notion of me wanting control to be quite triggering, because I immediately associated myself with people who were looking at relational control, i.e. I was whinging or blurting or ruminating to the psychiatrist about a situation that I don't prefer, and that actually I'd rather be the boss of it and tell everyone to leave me alone. That is not how I felt. That's not my reality. I know that's not even possible. It's not even desirable for me. But the reason I went down that alleyway is because that's what I'm used to, and that was my first understanding of what control meant. Second, when I had time to think, I went to an intellectual understanding of control, and that led me down into a thing called discipline. So intellectually or cognitively, I had a concept of control being about having discipline and turning up with, manners. You look good, you've got yourself out of bed, you're doing your to-do list, you're ticking things off, you're setting goals and reaching them, and you're successful and whatever. So then that led me to a place of shame, because I started to go, well, that's what control is. He's thinking, well, I'm ashamed of myself because I'm not sitting in my own power, I'm not reaching my own goals, and maybe I've set these high goals and the goals are whatever. I started going in that loop. That came not from having witnessed abuse before in power and control relationships, but that concept of control came from psychology and mental health. In the Western world in which I live and am part of, there is this big idea or underlining idea that the brain can control the body. The brain is the master of the body. The hypothalamus in the brain is the centre of the central nervous system, and mind can triumph over matter, or ideally that's what it is. So, if you can think it, if you can create some thought, some positive reality in your head, you can be it. And the idea that discipline rests on a concept of you can't have discipline if you don't have anything to measure it. You've got to be able to measure your discipline, and usually we measure that against rules and standards that might be from society and relationships or distance towards a goal or something, but they're externalities. So we measure how disciplined we are by external factors, not internal factors. And that resonated with me, and that's the way that I'd lived my life for forever up until now, basically. And even now it's hard for me to detach from that. So my second instinctual relationship with the word control was around the intellectual understanding of it, and that was validated by society, by mental health professionals, and by my understanding as a Westerner of Western psychology. So then I'm like, well, learned helplessness, what on earth is that? Where does this fit into it? And that's when I came to the third and final piece of the control pie, and that's around emotions. So emotional control rests around a concept of self-regulation. Self-regulation is where I believe it has the link with learned helplessness, or feeling helpless or helpful. Self-helpful. So unlike the cognitive definition of control, which is top down and mind over matter, self-regulation is very much bringing the whole self to the party and not letting the mind dominate, and in fact being mindful of that. So it's much more somatic and whole sensory. It's within this emotional part of the pie that I started to recognise myself, and I ended up turning or reimagining or rewriting the learned helplessness part as disability. This is my disability. So yes, when I am stuck in a position and feel like I'm helpless and I don't know what to do and I'm no power and no control, the learned helplessness in the official definition of the term comes from my trauma. And it comes from the trauma based in my reality. This is my reality, that this is what I've seen. And there have been many times when I've had to suck it up and endure. However, I now know there's an emotional part of it, which is for me. And that's the bit that I've often neglected, not through choice, but through invisibility. It's been invisible to me. As somebody who's autistic, my emotional landscape, my emotional feelings, how do I feel about that? They're on a different time again, a different time zone. I have sensory processing differences to norm. So I don't necessarily know how I feel in the moment, or know whether this is good for me or right, or have a preference that I can share until I've really thought about it. It takes me some time to check in with my body. It's not natural. I might have feelings and sensations going on and not really, or misinterpret them, or I might only notice things that are going on in my body when they've got to a point where they're overwhelming, and then I have a shutdown. I actually shut down or burn out. So there's a level around the helplessness for me, all coming under this control, under the subsection of emotional control, that is difficult, if not impossible, for me to do, at least in the moment, on my own, as somebody who's autistic and has ADHD, and then is made more complicated by the complex PTSD and the anxiety, which tend to shut down and make my thinking even more rigid and concrete. So the rigid, concrete thinking had led me into the conversation with my psychiatrist at the ripe old age of 48, nearly 49, and basically dumping things out and understanding his feedback, i.e. wanting more control for myself, in a very literal black or white way that's been informed by facts, i.e. the cognitive, and by experience, i.e. the domination and control. The bit of the puzzle that I need help with, and that fits nicely under the autism, is the emotion, and that's the bit where I have since found my power. So leaning into that, listening to the body and responding to the body as a whole, as opposed to leaving it all up to the mind and mind over matter. That's more Eastern in origin, in psychology origin. It's mentioned a lot in Chinese medicine and is the approach that a lot of Chinese therapy takes. So I found myself resonating with that and starting to lean into my body and and using that maybe as a guide as to what's going on. So what I realized is, if I start with self-regulation, and self-regulation is also, I've named it self-preservation. Preserve yourself first, put on your own life jacket, check yourself first. Are you preserving, are you coming to this party with and allowing all of your senses to be overwhelmed? Or is there a way that you can get, it's about control, but it's about control of the self. It's about introspection and maintaining, doing all you can first to make sure you've got the tools to look at the other things. If I don't start off with that, then I'm going to lose myself in the process, and that's exactly what was happening, or what is happening still, actually, because I haven't resolved it fully yet with myself and my father-in-law. What actually started off as feeling like an invalidation, and well, this always happens, I never get understood, and that very rigid black or white thinking shone a light onto so many things for me, and this is basically where I'll end it, and with the summary of what I learnt. Going through this exercise, making this video, doing the deep dive into all the definitions and history and blah blah blah, and then going back to me, it reminded me to check my rigid thinking. It's easy for me to forget that I think like that, because I am quite intelligent and creative, and I don't think rigidly full stop and that's it. I start thinking rigidly and I can communicate rigidly, but what happens inside is quite complex and nuanced, and I'm very, very capable of bringing emotion into that world. So check my thinking. The second thing is that the process has allowed me to expand my understanding of control and to weight the different portions, those 3 portions of control, in a way that's right for me as somebody who is disabled, someone who's neurodivergent, and also someone who has a trauma history, trauma-informed self-care for myself. So that was really nice. It gave me an opportunity to view and dissect my thinking, which has then allowed me to see how far I'm growing through this process, and also value making these videos, because to be honest, without this as an outlet, I probably wouldn't do it like this or resolve the things I do, because I'd run out of time, or I wouldn't have the things organised. It's hard for the executive processing to make these videos, but it's kind of rewarding to keep doing it, and it's kind of nice. Another thing that I learned through this is the difference between self-regulation and discipline. I had probably thought of those two things as the same. You regulate yourself, your emotions. I'd thought of self-regulation before as squashing the emotions. I hadn't imagined it or understood it as being actually checking and then working with and accommodating one's emotions. And again, that speaks to my trauma and my history of squashing and not having space for emotions, and certainly not understanding them. It's allowed me to see my disability, the learnt helplessness, which I flipped into actual real, validated helplessness. So it's allowed me to validate my experience and see my disability within my experience, and also where it fits, and that it's not all of it, but it's some of it. And with that, I can get help from therapists, third people, extra people, time, whatever. It's allowed me to reflect on my behaviour, i.e. when I turned up and started just going into blah 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 dumping of rumination, well, that's not a good use of my time, that wasn't a good use of my resources, so I can prepare better for those meetings in future. And finally, it's enabled me to build myself an action plan, or at least start. You know, you get to that point where you're like, what am I doing all this for? What's the point? This is really hard. I'm getting nowhere. It's just invalidating. Maybe I shouldn't make the videos. I don't know anything. I can't help myself. Look at me back in this position again. I just can't get out of the loop. I thought, well, I'm here because I'm alive. And what does it mean to be alive? It means to do, to explore, to play, to question. So that's what I did. I wrote a thing up with the acronym ALIVE. So ALIVE, A, assessment, L, learn, I, identify, V, venture, go on a venture, a quest, and E, evaluate. So my big learning, the last learning, was when I go to a social event, when I'm in a relational context and I come away feeling invalidated and misunderstood, give that relationship or that exchange some credit, be generous to myself, the other person, and the relationship. Come away and do some work. Remember you're alive, and being alive is about going through processes, being curious, and I can do this: assess, learn, identify, venture, and evaluate. Basically a scientific process or an investigative process, a deep dive, unpicking, unpacking, with the goal of creating a life that is worth living, which is also my goal. So in learning, I want to learn about myself to lead a life that I love, and that I can at least love myself. So that all came out of a conversation which felt like it went nowhere and cost me money. And I've got to wait 3 months before I can go back and say, I'm not going to do that. Like, listen to my poem about when I was mad with you and now I'm not mad with you. It sounds like a Taylor Swift event. But anyway, that's what I wanted to share. Hopefully it's not too long and winded and blah. But thanks for listening. Thank you for being here, and hopefully you have had some insights of your own that you'd like to share.